Breaking news just a few minutes ago, a measure to limit President Trump's ability to strike Venezuela passed a key procedural vote in the Senate. Let's bring in ABC's Jay O'Brien on Capitol Hill and senior Pentagon reporter Louis Martinez. So, Jay, what does this mean now? What happens next?
An extremely significant rebuke of President Trump, Diane, from a handful of Republicans who joined with all Senate Democrats to pass this measure through a key procedural vote. It's now going to get a full vote in the Senate. If the numbers from this vote hold, it's expected to pass there. It's not necessarily on track to being enacted. It's got to go through the House. And if it got through the House, President Trump would have to sign it.
Hey everyone, Dr. John here. What just happened? The walls are closing in from every direction at once. The military questioning his orders, the Senate stripping his war powers, the courts rejecting his immunity. Trump is discovering what every president eventually must. The American system was built to make sure no one, not even him, is above the law.
As we just heard, retired four-star General John Kelly, who was one of Donald Trump's White House chiefs of staff, told the New York Times Donald Trump would rule like a fascist if reelected. Kelly also spoke to The Atlantic's editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg for a new piece which quotes Donald Trump as once having said, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had." Goldberg is also moderator of Washington Week with The Atlantic here on PBS and joins us now. Thanks for being here.
Well, you know, we've known for several years from other reports, background reports mainly, that Trump, particularly in moments of high tension, think the 2020 George Floyd unrest, has expressed frustration that in a democracy, generals can't just be ordered to do things that they consider to be illegal or immoral.
What is happening right now inside the military chain of command and on the floor of the United States Senate represents the most comprehensive two-front institutional revolt against presidential authority that we have witnessed in modern American history. And the fact that it is happening simultaneously from the professional military establishment and from the legislative branch makes it unlike anything we have seen before. This is not a slow erosion of support. This is a sudden, coordinated collapse of the institutional pillars that any president needs to govern. Let me take you through what is unfolding, because the pieces of this story fit together in a way that reveals something deeply alarming for Donald Trump and deeply reassuring for anyone who believes in the Constitution. First, the military front. The most senior generals and admirals in the United States military are now publicly discussing something that was once discussed only in private, behind closed doors, in the most classified settings. They are talking about the oath to the Constitution, not to the president, not to the commander-in-chief, to the Constitution. And they are discussing in public, on live television, in institutional settings, the framework for refusing unlawful commands. Let me be clear about what this means. The military oath is not a pledge of loyalty to whoever holds the office of the presidency. It is a solemn vow to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath is the most fundamental commitment that any service member makes. It is the foundation of military professionalism, and it is deliberately designed to ensure that the armed forces answer to the rule of law, not to the whims of any individual leader, no matter how powerful. When senior military officials go on live television and say that their oath is to the Constitution, not to Trump personally, they are not expressing a policy disagreement. They are establishing an institutional framework. They are communicating to every service member, from four-star generals to the most junior enlisted personnel, that the standard for evaluating commands is constitutional legality, not automatic obedience. They are saying in the most public way possible that if a command is unlawful, the oath requires refusal. This is not a hypothetical discussion. It is happening in real time. John Kelly, the former chief of staff and retired four-star general, publicly stated that Trump meets the definition of a fascist. 7 four-star generals coordinated a joint statement about dereliction of duty. The conversation about refusing unlawful commands is happening openly in the most formal institutional settings among the most credentialed military voices in the country. And the framing that has emerged from these discussions, the idea that a president who demands unlawful compliance is, in the most most fundamental sense, betraying the oath that every service member has taken has resonated so powerfully because it captures a documented institutional reality. Now, I need to be precise about one element of this story. The specific claim that a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs looked Trump in the eye and called him a traitor to his face comes from widely shared narratives and analysis videos. That specific confrontation is not formally verified by journalism. But here is why that framing is spreading so powerfully, and why it so accurately describes the documented institutional reality. What is verified is that senior military officials are publicly and formally discussing the oath to the Constitution framework. They are openly saying that the standard for compliance is constitutional law, not presidential command. They are establishing, in the most public way possible, that the military establishment is operating under a constitutional loyalty framework, not an automatic obedience framework. The traitor framing resonates because the documented institutional reality supports that dramatic characterization as an accurate summary of what senior military leaders are communicating about the fundamental conflict between the constitutional oath and Trump's commands. Now let's turn to the second front of this institutional revolt. While the military establishment is publicly establishing the constitutional oath framework, the United States Senate is moving to block Trump's war powers in a way that has not happened in decades. The Senate voted 52 to 47 to advance a war powers resolution that would block further unauthorized military action in or against Venezuela. Every Democrat voted for the measure. 5 Republicans crossed party lines to support it, and some coverage specifically warned that if opposition continues to grow toward the 2/3 mark, as many as 60 senators could be willing to stop or override Trump's most aggressive war plans. Let me walk you through what this vote actually means. The Senate did not just debate the resolution, they advanced it. They went on the record. 5 Republicans looked at Trump's Venezuela strategy, looked at the accumulating costs of his military adventurism, and decided that they could not support him. In the most traditionally deferential domain of presidential authority, war powers, Republicans broke ranks. And the number 5 is significant. It is not a few stray moderates. It is a faction large enough to signal serious discomfort within the party. But the most consequential dimension of this vote is the trajectory that some analysts identified. The vote was 52 to 47 to advance. That is the baseline bipartisan coalition. But if that coalition grows to 60 senators, something fundamental changes. 60 senators is the veto-proof threshold. It is the number at which the Senate can override a presidential veto. It is the number at which a symbolic rebuke becomes a binding constraint. And the fact that coverage specifically identified a potential 60-senator coalition as the growing opposition trajectory means that the people who understand Senate arithmetic are watching the same thing we are watching. The accumulated costs of Trump's war strategies are pushing more Republicans toward accountability. Now, I need to explain what happened after that vote, because it reveals something crucial about how fragile Trump's hold on war powers has become. After the 52 to 47 advancement vote, Senate Republicans used a narrow procedural maneuver to block a final vote on the resolution. The resolution did not pass. But here is what matters: the fact that they needed a procedural maneuver at all. If Trump's war powers support were comfortably intact, if the Republican conference were united behind him, there would have been no need for parliamentary maneuvering. The resolution would have been defeated on the merits in an open vote, with the majority comfortably voting it down. But that is not what happened. What happened is that Republican leadership could not allow a final vote because the outcome was uncertain. They did not know if the resolution would pass. They did not know if more Republicans would break ranks, so they used a procedural maneuver to prevent the vote from happening at all. That is the definition of a fragile hold. When you need to use parliamentary tricks to prevent your own members from voting because you are not sure how they will vote, you do not have a majority. You have a precarious coalition that requires constant protection from itself, and that is precisely what the Venezuela war powers debate revealed. Trump's hold on Senate war power support is not a sturdy foundation. It is a fragile structure that requires procedural scaffolding to keep it from collapsing. So let me bring these two fronts together, because the simultaneous nature of what is happening is what makes this moment historic. On one front, the military establishment is publicly establishing the constitutional oath framework. Senior generals and admirals are saying in the most formal and public ways that their loyalty is to the Constitution, not not to the president, and that unlawful commands will be refused. On the other front, the Senate is building a bipartisan coalition to block unauthorized military action, a coalition that is approaching the veto-proof threshold and that required procedural protection to prevent it from passing. These two fronts are reinforcing each other. The military's public discussion of the oath to the Constitution framework gives senators the political cover they need to break with Trump on war powers. When senior military officials are saying on live television that the president may be issuing unlawful commands, it becomes much easier for a Republican senator to vote to restrict his war authority. And the Senate's growing willingness to block unauthorized military action gives military officials the institutional backing they need to assert the constitutional oath framework. When Congress is moving to constrain the president's war powers, it becomes much harder for the White House to claim that its military commands are obviously lawful and must be obeyed. This is how the system is supposed to work. The founders designed the Constitution to create exactly this kind of dynamic. Separate institutions with separate powers, checking each other, constraining each other, ensuring that no single branch, no single individual can operate above the law. The military oath is to the Constitution, not to the president, so that the armed forces answer to the rule of law. Congress has the power of the purse and the power to declare war, so that the president cannot commit the nation to armed conflict without legislative consent. The courts have the power to enforce the law, even against the president, so that no one is above judicial authority. What we are witnessing is all of these institutional checks activating simultaneously. The military is publicly establishing the constitutional oath framework. The Senate is building a bipartisan coalition to block unauthorized war powers. The courts have already issued rulings that strip away immunity and clear the path to trial. And the president, who thought he could operate above all of these constraints, is discovering that he cannot. Now, let me give you 4 concrete points to take away from everything we have covered, because understanding what to watch for as this story develops is as important as understanding what has already happened. The public discussion of the oath to the Constitution framework by senior military officials is the single most alarming institutional accountability signal in this entire story. It is not just one officer expressing a personal policy disagreement. It is the most senior voices in the military establishment publicly establishing the standard by which commands will be evaluated. They are communicating to the entire chain of command, from the Pentagon to the forward operating bases, that constitutional legality is the standard, and that unlawful commands will trigger the oath-driven obligation to refuse. That public framework establishment challenges the fundamental assumption that the military will automatically comply with presidential commands, and that assumption is what the most expansive claims of commander-in-chief authority depend on. The 52-47 war powers vote, combined with the potential 60-senator coalition trajectory, is the most documented Senate accountability signal. The bipartisan baseline is established. 5 Republicans are already on the record crossing over in the most traditionally deferential domain of presidential authority, and the trajectory towards 60 is what matters most. A static 52-senator coalition is one thing. A growing coalition that is building toward the veto-proof threshold is something entirely different. It means that as the costs of Trump's war strategies accumulate, as the political pressures mount, more Republican senators are moving toward accountability. The 8 additional senators needed to reach 60 are the ones whose political cost calculations are shifting in real time. The fact that Senate Republicans needed to use a narrow procedural maneuver to block a final vote is the most revealing institutional signal about the fragility of Trump's war powers hold. If support were comfortable, there would have been no need for procedural protection. The resolution would have been defeated in an open vote with the majority confidently voting it down. But that is not what happened. What happened is that Republican leadership could not allow a final vote because they did not know how it would go. That is the definition of a fragile hold. That is the most precise institutional measure of how specifically Trump's war powers authority has been contested. Here is what we need to watch as this story continues to develop. First, the oath to the Constitution framework trajectory. Will the public discussion produce more formal institutional expressions? Will additional senior military voices go public with the same framework? Will the conversation move from individual officers to collective institutional statements? Second, the 60-senator trajectory. Will the political costs of Trump's Venezuela and Iran strategies push more Republican senators to cross over? Will the coalition grow from 52 towards 60? Will it reach the veto-proof threshold? Third, the procedural bloc sustainability. Can Republican leadership continue to protect Trump with procedural maneuvers as the political pressure increases? Or will the fragile hold collapse before the midterm elections? Fourth, the two-front convergence. Will the military's constitutional oath framework and the Senate's growing war powers coalition develop simultaneously, boxing in Trump's authority from both directions? Will the combined impact of these two institutional revolts permanently establish fundamental limits on the most extreme claims of commander-in-chief authority? The bottom line is this: senior generals and admirals are publicly discussing the oath to the Constitution framework and the standard for refusing unlawful commands on live television and in institutional settings. That public framework is challenging the essential assumption that the military will automatically comply with presidential commands. The Senate voted 52 to 47 to advance a war powers resolution blocking unauthorized military action in Venezuela, with 5 Republicans crossing over. Some coverage identified a potential 60-senator coalition as the growing opposition trajectory toward the veto-proof threshold. Although a procedural maneuver blocked a final vote, that maneuver was necessary precisely because the outcome was uncertain. That necessity is the most precise institutional measure of how fragile Trump's war powers hold has become. And the characterization that Trump is facing a two-front institutional revolt from the military establishment and from the Senate is the most accurate description of the documented reality we are witnessing. This is the moment when the system pushes back. This is the moment when the institutions that have held this country together for nearly 250 years activate to constrain a president who thought he could operate above them. The military is publicly establishing that its oath is to the Constitution, not to the president. The Senate is building a bipartisan coalition to take away the president's war powers. The courts have stripped away his immunity and cleared the path to trial. And Donald Trump, who spent his entire political career believing that rules are for other people, is discovering the fundamental truth that the founders embedded in the Constitution. No one is above the law. Stay tuned. The 60-senator trajectory is the most consequential variable to watch. The oath to the Constitution public framework is expanding, and we will be right here covering every development as it unfolds.